Hey, in this lesson, we are going to be connecting to the endpoint, so the executable endpoint where we've got the JSON data that's coming from our spreadsheet and using JavaScript to connect to that endpoint. The editor that I'm using is going to be the Visual Studio Code and making use of the extension, the live server extension, in order to run an HTTP local machine on my computer. So if you are using another editor, make sure that you do have ability to run within the HTTP protocol so that you're not running the files on the file protocol. So let's walk through, and I'll do a quick walkthrough of the Visual Studio Code. So you can go over to code.visualstudio.com and go ahead and download the version for your system. They've got Mac OS, Windows, as well as Linux. And then once it's installed, open up the Visual Studio Code. So this is the Visual Studio Code editor here, just on top of the browser window. I've created an index page, so let's specify this and set the doc type, and then also the HTML main container, and then within here set up a head title, and I'll call it sheet data. And within the sheet data, create the body, and within body, let's create an element with a class of output, and this is actually going to output the content coming from the spreadsheet data endpoint. And then just after we've loaded the DOM content, let's set up the script, set a source for the script, and I'm going to call it app.js, or it could be app.js. So whatever you want to call the file. Actually, I'll call it app.js. So this is what we need for our basic HTML. And if you don't have Live Server installed, you can go to the Visual Studio Code. Under the file, just add the folder to the workspace or save it as a new workspace. So that way this file is going to be the root for the workspace. It's going to be looking for an index file for the root of the workspace. And under code, and then go to preferences and extensions. And this will list out all of the extensions that you have. The one that I'm using is going to be Live Server. So currently Live Server is version 5.61. And go ahead and do an install, or you can search for the extension Live Server and then do an install of it. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to launch a local server with the Live Server repository. It's got some information about how this works. So once you've set up Live Server, make sure that you've enabled it. So make sure that when you go to your extensions, you see Live Server, it's enabled and it's installed. And then once you have that, you can go over to anywhere on your file and open with Live Server. And what that will do is that's going to launch the page within the local machine. So using the local IP address using port 5500, and we can see the title of the page is there. And let's do an inspect. I'm using Chrome DevTools, doing an inspect. It's actually going to be missing one of the files there, the app.js file. So we know it's connected and it's using the right one. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And this is going to be where our JavaScript is going to go, and save this file as app.js. And just save it within the same workspace folder. So now we've got the app.js. You can also make this, or I'll make this bigger so it's easier to read. And what we want to do before we conclude this lesson is using the JavaScript fetch to make our request over to the endpoint. So let's first go back to our app script and manage the deployments. Select the web app URL, copy that, go back into your app.js and create a variable, call it URL, and then just paste in that super long web app URL, because we're going to need that in order to make the fetch request to that URL. And let's create a function and call it we'll call it get data, and it's going to load the data onto the page, and this is where we're going to hold the fetch request. So we invoke the function get data. So when the app runs, it sets the URL to whatever the endpoint URL is. It runs the get data function, and then within the get data function, for now, we make a fetch request to the URL, so to going to the endpoint. And because this is going to be already JSON data, we can run a function that's going to do a return of the response information, and then within the response we can return the content as response JSON data. So it's built into fetch. Whenever it's got JSON data, then it can handle the JSON data and turn it into a JavaScript object. And then in the next promise, we're going to pick up the content as data, so as a data object, and simply output it into the console for now. So make sure that we've got the connection before we try to do something with the data. Let's go over to the web app URL, and there's our data, and this is all coming from the live data from the spreadsheet, and outputting the content, the title, and we've got the up and downs as well. So coming up next, we want to make this more interactive, and we want to actually post some data back to the web app. So that's still all coming up in the upcoming lessons. So go ahead and set up your local machine, make the connection to the endpoint, and make a fetch request to get the data from the spreadsheet, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.